Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. What would you do if you had power? I suspect we're not much different to the apostles, but Jesus tells them and us, no. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Well, last week we covered a large section of chapter 10 of Mark's Gospel in which people asked big questions. They asked questions about the legality of divorce and the circumstances of divorce, and about the status and entry into the kingdom of God, about wealth and blessing and entry into the kingdom of God. And Jesus keeps turning things around, because the questions reveal something seriously wrong in the way we humans think about ourselves. We ask questions as if we're the good guys in the story, that we can be important enough for God to approve of us, that our wealth or our social status or our law-keeping are some indication of our worth, of our value before God. And Jesus shocks them, and shocks people today, by saying that we don't understand our situation regarding God's kingdom at all, that even the very best of us are disqualified from heaven, that even for the very best of us, getting into God's kingdom is impossible. Yes, that means you too, according to Jesus, because there's something deeply wrong with us that we cannot change. Our hearts are sinful, rebellious against God. It's not something we can treat with drugs or therapy. It's not a social problem that can be managed by social engineering. Sin is not something like having an ice cream or a chocolate that is sinfully good. Sin is not even just breaking the law, but it's deeply evil rebellion against the creator of the universe for which we are personally responsible. A deep wrongness in our hearts that we cannot change. But Jesus also said that while it's impossible for us to undo our sin, it's impossible for us to be reconciled with God from our own activity, it is possible for God to do it. And so we must come to Him as dependent as children if we want to enter the kingdom of God. We've heard this so clearly, but friends, have we seen it as true of ourselves? It's really no surprise that the section ends with another account of a blind man. Like the blind man of chapter 8, this blind man is a physical illustration and a challenge of whether we are able to see. Today we're introduced to a blind man named Bartimaeus, and maybe we're given his name and the translation of his name, because when Mark wrote this, Bartimaeus was still alive, and people could go and check the story. So he gives Bartimaeus' name and tells us, oh, that's the son of Timaeus. And he might be saying, you know Timaeus, you can go and check with his son whether this is true. But Bartimaeus is a man who recognises his utter dependence on Jesus. Like the children in the previous section that the disciples didn't think him important enough to bother with, but Jesus stopped. He restored the sight of this man, and Bartimaeus followed him. Verse 52. This is here to challenge us. Will we do that? Will we recognise that we need Jesus if we are going to see how we are going to get into the kingdom of God? This account of Bartimaeus comes after perhaps the most important and clear statements from Jesus about what he came to do. It's what we need to understand Christianity is all about. And it's Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Make sure you're looking at it so you can see that it's not just Cameron saying this, but an eyewitness account of what Jesus said. But before I read that verse again, I want us to listen to a passage from the Psalms that really should be ringing in our ears as we read Mark 10:45. And as I read from Psalm 49 verses 5 and following, listen out for the words redeem and ransom, both of which mean to buy back. Psalm 49 verses 5 and following. Why should I fear when evil days come, when wicked deceivers surround me, those who trust in their wealth and boast of their great riches? No one can redeem the life of another or give to God a ransom for them. The ransom for a life is costly. No payment is ever enough so that they should live on forever and not see decay. For all can see that the wise die, that the foolish and the senseless also perish, leaving their wealth to others. Their tombs will remain their houses forever, their dwellings for endless generations, though they had named lands after themselves. People, despite their wealth, do not endure. They are like the beasts that perish. This is the fate of those who trust in themselves, and of their followers who approve their sayings. They are like sheep, and are destined to die. Death will be their shepherd, but the upright will prevail over them in the morning. Their forms will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself. And with that ringing in our ears, hear what Jesus says in Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. As Jesus headed toward Jerusalem, causing unease and fear among his disciples, Jesus predicts his death at least 4 times. In 8 verse 31, he said that his death was a necessary part of God's plan. He must die. In chapter 9, verses 11 to 13, he said it was the last thing that had to occur before the arrival of the kingdom of God. In chapter 9, verse 31, he said it would come by his being betrayed into human hands. And then in chapter 10, verses 33 and 34, it's a climax of all those predictions, and he says that it is going to come from Israel's leaders handing him over to the Gentiles. Now, to be handed over to the Gentiles in Israel's history meant to be handed over into God's wrath, handed over to God's punishment. And now Israel's leaders are going to hand over the Messiah to the Gentiles to suffer under God's wrath. And in chapter 10, verse 34, we are told what the Gentiles are going to do. They will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise. He will be mocked, spit upon, scourged before being killed in the worst possible way, crucified, shamed under the curse of God. But the big question is why? Now, we've been told it's part of God's plan. We've been told it's necessary. But what part does it play in God's plan? What did the betrayal and the arrest and the handing over and the suffering and the death, why did it all have to happen? On the road up to Jerusalem, with the cross clearly before him, and with his disciples oblivious to the moment, squabbling among themselves about who among them is the greatest, Jesus gathers them and explains why he had to die. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. His death would be a ransom, a price paid to release something or someone from captivity. a price paid to secure someone's freedom. If you were a slave in those days, a ransom could buy your freedom. If you were a prisoner of war, a ransom would let you go home. In Israel's history, they knew something about being ransomed from slavery. That great act of God in the Old Testament was his rescue of his people from slavery in Egypt. He ransomed them. He redeemed them. He purchased their freedom. And then over years they forgot God and they were taken again into the nations in exile as slaves again. But God promised through the prophet Isaiah that he would again redeem them. In so marvellous a way would he redeem them again that the old Exodus with Moses would seem just like a shadow. God would ransom them from the captivity into which their sins had landed them. He would redeem, purchase back from the judgment of God under which they had fallen, and he would do that for people of the nations too. And as Jesus heads to the cross, he explains why he was going to die at the hands of the nations. He explained why it had to happen. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' death was the ransom price paid so that many others could be released from their captivity and go free. And as he headed toward Jerusalem, this momentous event in God's great plan through all history, as he headed toward the centre of all human history, his disciples are wondering who among them is going to be the best. Chapter 10, verse 35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, what do you want? We want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let whatever sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. They wanted the two positions of greatest power when Jesus was revealed to all as Messiah, as the judge of all. At last they'd understood that the day of the kingdom is coming. At least they've got that. Of course, these two aren't alone in their desire to be the best. We see in verse 41 the response of the other disciples is anger and indignation, not because James and John had asked the question, but because they asked it before the others had a chance to. What drives this desire for greatness that we all seem to have? To be seen as better than the others. Isn't that what drives gossip? A desire to tell others how bad those people are compared to what we are like? Or we want to win. We want to find ourselves better than other people. And so we tell stories about how we've done well and how they've failed. We want to take advantage of opportunities to get ahead. It happens all over the world, doesn't it? People tell the rest of the world what makes them good, and they try and get the inside track to greatness, the inside track to the moment of glory, to be the closest to the Great One, just like these two men from northern Israel. A part of the country the rest of the country looked down upon, and so they're trying to get a leapfrog above everyone and get the admiration that others have for Jesus and have a bit of that for themselves. It's not the first time this idea of greatness has been on the disciples' mind. Peter's problem with Jesus' statement about his suffering and as a Messiah was that Jesus wasn't going to look as victorious enough. And back in chapter 9, verse 33, Jesus has asked the disciples what they were talking about as they walked along the road, and the disciples were embarrassed because, again, they'd be arguing about who was going to be the greatest. And now James and John still have it in mind, and they try to get in first. But Jesus has already said in chapter 9, verse 35, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. True greatness, says Jesus, is found in service, but they clearly just cannot get that into their minds. These people knew about being servants, they knew about being slaves, and they didn't want that. Where does being a servant, where does being a slave get you? If you only have one life, and it's pretty tough, the little people get crushed and forgotten. The great ones are the ones who are rich and powerful. You want to be like that. Life's too short and brutish and nasty to be the weak. A life of service is unimpressive. It's insecure. There's no benefit in humility. There's only humiliation. The human desire for greatness is a desire for security in a hostile world. And we're constantly living in the shadow of death. We're frail. We get sick. We know our demons. We know hatred and hostility. We know injustice and wickedness. We know oppression. We know what it is to sin against others and also to be sinned against ourselves. We grow old. We fade away. We die. We're forgotten. We know the other facts of this world where the shadow of death is far more powerful. So we try and ward that off by the more wealth we have and try and put off the evil day. We try and get more education and more wisdom and try to ward off the day that we know is coming. Don't talk to me about service, Jesus. Do you want me to be pushed around for the rest of my life? Don't talk to me about service, Jesus. Do you want me to be content with a life of suffering and pain and oppression? Don't talk to me about service, Jesus. Do you want me to let the grave eat me even while I'm living? As Jesus walks toward Jerusalem, as he heads directly to the cross, to the climax of God's eternal plans, he takes the squabbling disciples aside and he talks to them about their plans for greatness. Verse 41, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John, and Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." How perverse our hearts are. Just look with me at what human greatness does in our world. We lust after greatness so that we can be secure in the world, and then when we get it, we humans show ourselves to just be part of the hostile world that harms others. Who do you want to be like? Asked Jesus. Do you want to be like those religious leaders we've seen so far? So zealous about religious duty that they resent a man being healed on the Sabbath? Do you want to be like that? Or do you want to be like the political leaders like Herod who are plotting to kill the Christ? The man who entertains people by gathering officials to celebrate his birthday, who is so frivolously wealthy and powerful that he can promise up to half his kingdom to a girl who danced for him as dinner-time entertainment. Do you want to be like Herod, a man so tainted by power and status that he placed a human head on a platter on the table just because that girl asked for it? Well, that's the kind of thing that human greatness and human power looks like. Do you really want to be like that, my disciples? Or do you want to be like the Gentile kings, those irresistible forces like Rome? Do you want to replace them, but be just like them when you come to your time to have power? Is that what you're wanting, disciples? Friends, who do you want to look like? Who are your heroes? Jesus asks, do you really want to be like that celebrity who promotes themselves as the highest good, whose desire above all is to be recognised by as many people as possible, to be watched, to be lusted after? Do you want to be like the ones in power, like the ones who arrested and mocked and scourged and crucified Jesus? Is that who you want to be like? No, we need to be rescued from great ones like that, not copy them, not to aspire to be just like them. Aspiring to take over their leadership ends up making us just as ugly as they were. Because that use of power is a part of the problem. It's actually part of God's judgment. No, what we need, what James and John, what all the rest of us too need, is to be rescued from that kind of thing. We need to be ransomed. We need to be redeemed from all of those things. The desire for greatness that is within us makes us into the same beasts that we want to overcome, and there is no future in that. We need rescue from those beasts, but we must also recognise that the beast lies in each of us. Back in chapter 7, you'll remember that Jesus said that the real problem is our human heart. It is what comes out of the person that defiles them, says Jesus in chapter 7 verse 15, and in chapter 7 verse 23, evil come from inside and defile a person. Dear friends, we live in a world that is characterised by hostile people and suffering people. And to ward off our insecurity, we often believe that we must be great at all costs. We must achieve. We must gain wealth and be secure for ourselves and for our family. We must acquire. And having attained as much as we possibly can, what we have to do is stop other people taking it away from us. And so we end up being enslaved to greed and envy and jealousy and pride and gossip and meanness. And the disciples, just like us, want that kind of greatness. And Jesus teaches these disciples again why he is going to die. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. A slave in those days could pay a ransom and find release. But there was one thing for which there's no ransom great enough to be delivered. We read about it in the beginning of Psalm 45. There's no way of escaping the grave. There is a price that can be paid. There really is a price that can be paid that can prevent us from going into eternity, into death with no hope. That is the ultimate insecurity of our world, isn't it? The fear of death. It drives our quest for greatness, but nothing can rescue us from that grave. Nothing can rescue until now, says Jesus. He came preaching the kingdom of God. To the rich young ruler, he invited him to stop trusting in his wealth and follow him instead. Jesus' death has a key place in God's plan. Jesus' death is the ransom for many. Jesus' death is the ransom for all Israel who would believe, and all the world if they would only follow him and depend on him. His death is the ransom, and it ensures the destruction of all beastly human power. Jesus' death is the ransom that secures the arrival of the kingdom of God. Jesus' death is the ransom that secures us against the beast within us, as well as the beasts outside of us. Jesus' death is the ransom that brings a revolution in human life, a revolution that transforms hearts from their obsession with greatness and ransoms them to be hearts that are committed to a lifetime of service. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.